All right. So just wrapping up the last concept here from chapter 13. It's all about reflexes. Okay. So not everything, even outside of our visceral control and outside of our autonomic nervous system, even information that is going to be processed by the central nervous system and that you are going to perceive and be consciously aware of is still going to be controlled somewhat autonomically and subconsciously. Okay. And so that kind of control, that response uh, before perception, before awareness, is a reflex. And so we'll be talking about these reflex arcs and some different examples of how those reflex arcs are organized and how they work. Okay? But as I was saying, this is essentially autonomic response via the central nervous system. This is part of the CNS, but is done without conscious control, without necessarily needing conscious control. So in the same way that some of our skeletal muscles, like our diaphragm and the skeletal muscles of our eyelids and the skeletal muscles that control breathing, um, or sorry, swallowing, so we talked about diaphragm. Those are all skeletal muscles. You can consciously control them. You can control your breath. You can control your blinking, control your swallowing, but they are regulated autonomically, and you don't have to be aware of them in order for them to be working. It's kind of the same thing with these reflexes. They are going to fire without somatic control, but you can influence them with somatic control. So anyways, there are 5 main steps to our reflex arcs. Some of our faster reflex arcs are basically going to skip this interneuron processor phase, but can be affected by a different processor. Anyways, sorry, I think I'm complicating this earlier than it needs to be. Let's start with the basics, the 5 steps of a basic reflex arc. So this is always going to start with a receptor, the part of the body that is receiving this stimulus. So either stretch or damage in some way. And that is going to activate the sensory neuron, which is part of our afferent system, the affectors, as far as the verb of that term, affect. So this is what this is the starting point causing the effect. Anyways, the effector, part of our afferent system, this is the sensory neuron that is responding to that stimulus and sending the signal to the central nervous system, so the spinal cord. We then have an interneuron, in which we can call our processor, and this is what is providing that central nervous system control, which is going to be an autonomic response first off, and then can later be modulated by our somatic system. And so that interneuron is then going to stimulate the motor neuron, which is going to carry the response to the effector, so what is going to react. So we have the receptor, which is sensing the stimulus, that is going to stimulate your sensory neuron. That neuron is going to carry that sensory information to the spinal cord, where it will synapse with a processor or an interneuron. And then that interneuron will stimulate a motor neuron, which is going to cause a response in your effector, so the part of the body that is responding. So those interneurons can be organized in a few different ways, depending on what the pool looks like, how that information is going to be transmitted. So we have the sensory neuron, or I think it makes more sense to kind of skip to this really quick. So we have our receptor stimulating the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron brings the information to the spinal cord, where it synapses with an interneuron. That interneuron is then going to stimulate a motor neuron, which is going to cause a reaction in our effector, right? The muscle or the gland. And so these interneurons, right, this processor, the central nervous system control portion of this reflex, can distribute that information in different ways. And so they can diverge in synapse with multiple motor neurons after that, or more sensory neurons to send information to the brain. That is called divergence. We can have convergence of multiple interneurons synapsing with the same effector or motor neuron. We can have serial processing, which is essentially just a straight line. Parallel processing, where we have multiple neurons being stimulated in response to the same signal. And then reverberation, which is essentially like a positive feedback loop, where because that signal has been sent, that it's going to stimulate that next neuron to then stimulate the previous neuron, which is going to cause it to stimulate that next neuron again. So we have this positive feedback loop called reverberation. So these signals can diverge into multiple pathways. They can converge into a single pathway. They can just be linear. We can cause serial processing in multiple directions after divergence. That would be parallel processing. And then we can have a positive feedback circuit, which is reverberation. So a simple reflex arc would look like this. So in this case, we have someone laying their hand down onto a nail. So we're going to feel some pain, right? So that stimulus is the pain being sensed by the palm of the hand, which is our receptor. That stimulates this sensory neuron to carry that pain signal to the central nervous system, where it synapses with an interneuron. That interneuron is then diverging. Here we have some divergence of this interneuron, where the fastest pathway is going to be where it synapses with the motor neuron. That motor neuron is then going to stimulate contraction at our effector, in this case, which is our biceps brachii, to flex our elbow, pulling our arm away from that painful stimulus. And all of that can happen without you being consciously aware, or either simultaneously with, or maybe even a little bit before you are consciously aware of the pain that you are sensing from that stimulus. Right? So we have this divergence with this interneuron also going to send that pain signal up towards the brain. Right? And depending on when and where it is going to synapse with another neuron in that sensory pathway, that motor response may be faster or slower, then your brain becomes aware of what's happening. And so that is a reflex. And then once you are consciously aware of what's happening, you can fight that response. Right? So immediately you might feel a little jerk as your arm wants to pull away, but if you, for some reason, wanted to continue pressing, right, you can control and fight that and inhibit the reflex part and instead continue pushing forward. But this includes all 5 of those stages. So in some cases, we're going to skip that processor. And so we're just going to have a sensory neuron directly synapsing on a motor neuron to cause that response. And that's going to be an even faster reflex. That is called a monosynaptic reflex. So your patellar reflex is an example of a monosynaptic reflex. Right? And so we're going to have a sensory neuron in the muscle sensing stretch in this case. So as pressure is applied to the patellar tendon, which is basically a grouping of all of the tendons from your quadriceps muscles and many of the ligaments of the knee into that patellar tendon. So as we apply pressure, that is going to stretch this muscle, stretch that tendon, which could be perceived as potential damage. And so your body wants to protect this muscle from that damage by trying to counteract that movement and prevent it from stretching too far. So in response to that stretch signal being sent to the spinal cord, it synapses directly onto the motor neuron, which is going to come and stimulate your quadriceps muscles to contract so that you are moving in an antagonistic way to that stretch stimulus, right? So now that this is contracting, it is shortening the distance between your tibia and whatever the origins for all these muscles, right? And thus reducing that stretch. So that is a monosynaptic reflex. There is one synapse from sensory neuron directly to motor neuron. So this one is a lot harder to consciously control. But again, you can. There are going to be other neurons that can synapse here to inhibit that signal, or you can stimulate other signals that are going to counteract what your reflex wants to do. And then lots of our synapses are polysynaptic, meaning that the interneuron is going to synapse with many other neurons. So we're going to have multiple pathways being stimulated at once. So in this case, we are going to be in the process of moving towards this painful stimulus as we go to grab this hot pan. So that pain signal gets sent from the sensory neuron all the way to our interneuron. And that interneuron is going to both send signals up towards the brain to make us aware of this pain, and it is going to send motor signals to opposite sides of our arm in this case. We want to stimulate our flexors to pull the arm away, and at the same time, we want to inhibit our extensors as we were in motion trying to grab this thing. Right? So you want to stop the extension of reaching out at the same time that you are stimulating the flexion. If we only had stimulation of flexion happening without inhibition of your extension, you may just have your arm freeze, right? So we have both signals occurring to fully allow for that reflexive movement of moving away from this painful stimulus. So this is polysynaptic. There are multiple synapses so that we can control flexion and inhibition. We can stimulate that flexion to move away and inhibit extension so that we are no longer moving towards this painful stimulus. And so this can be even more complicated with something that affects like a larger system like our balance. So essentially with the same setup of one part of our body is going towards a painful stimulus, but in this case, it's happening in our legs. And so while we are in motion, right, taking a step. And so if we simply had that same pathway where we are going to flex the hamstrings of the leg that was stepping on that painful stimulus, and we are going to inhibit the extension of the quadriceps of that same leg, right? That doesn't do anything to help our movement and protect us from just falling flat on our face, because this person is in motion, they are stepping with their right leg, they feel this pain, which means they're going to pull their right leg back up. And if their left leg was still pushing their body forward, you're now just going to fall flat on your face. So we're also going to stimulate muscle control of the opposite leg to allow us to stay standing up and not fall flat on our face. So we had this painful stimulus sensed by the sole of this right foot. That receptor stimulated the sensory neuron, which is going to synapse with this interneuron, which has an extensive polysynaptic pathway with other interneurons, which have extensive polysynaptic pathways, so that we can have that antagonistic control of the leg that was already experiencing damage, so of the leg with the receptor, and antagonistic control of the opposite leg, again, to keep us standing. So we're going to stimulate flexion of the right leg and inhibit extension in order to pull that right leg away. And simultaneously, we're going to stimulate extension and inhibit flexion of the left leg. So to do the opposite of the motion that we were already in progress doing. So instead of stepping forward with our left leg, we are now trying to extend our left leg flat as we pull our right leg back to our body. And with that reflex, we have successfully protected us from this painful stimulus and prevented us from falling flat on our face. And so that's one of the most complex networks of this reflex arc. That, again, is happening autonomically. You don't necessarily need to be aware of what's occurring in order for this to protect you. Pretty cool. And so having understandings or a deeper understanding of these different types of reflexes, right? How many synapses are involved, which sensory and motor pathways are involved in the sensation and response to these things, which we're going to be learning much more about in chapter 16. Combining all that knowledge together, we can test these different reflex arcs and reflex pathways in order to get a better understanding of where and what system may be impacted. And so one of those examples that is applying that information at multiple levels is this Babinski reflex or plantar reflex. So one of your major motor pathways essentially fully matures at around 2 years old. And so there's a lot of somatic control in that reflex because of how late developmentally that motor pathway is finishing. And that can be easily tested or is commonly tested with what is referred to as the Babinski reflex. So in a fully mature adult with a finished corticospinal pathway, if you sense this stimulus, this pressure on the sole of your foot, that should stimulate a plantar flexion response. right, as that reflex to get away from that stimulus on the arch of your foot. Right? But before that pathway is fully developed, you get this Babinski reflex where just the toes are spread out and you actually go towards or move your foot towards that sensation instead. And so if there is damage to this corticospinal tract of your motor pathway and or damage to higher level control, instead of getting this plantar reflex, you see that same Babinski reflex. And so I won't act like I have the level of understanding to fully get the application of this information. But that's just one example of utilizing our understanding of reflex arcs along with understanding of sensory and motor pathways and understanding the autonomic versus higher level control of these reflexes altogether to test for damage or to use this reflex to get a better understanding of where the neural damage is in this patient. Um, so yeah, hopefully that stuff will come together even better as we start introducing the sensory and motor pathways and get a better understanding of our autonomic nervous system as well. So that's it for chapter 13, and I will see you guys in the next one as we talk about the other half of our central nervous system, which is the brain. See you then.